Alright, our next topic is learning and the process of learning. When we get into learning, we're going to get a lot into behavioral conditioning. We're going to get a lot into classical and operant conditioning, and then into cognitive learning, which is a whole other thing. But we're going to start a little bit with cognitive learning and look at the definition and the way that learning works. So learning is a lasting change as a result of practice, study, or experience. It's not a result of maturation. When we talk about, for instance, how humans learn to walk, we don't really learn to walk. We mature into that ability. Our muscles grow stronger, our sense of balance increases. We physically mature into the ability to walk. Our ability to adapt the way we walk may be a learned thing. Our gait can be learned, but the ability to move yourself on two legs is something that's matured into. On the other hand, learning to speak is learned. And while we mature into the ability to speak, we do learn our primary language. It's not a naturally occurring thing. Learning curves describe how easy, essentially, it is to learn something. An easy task, like for instance tying your shoes, has what we refer to as a very steep learning curve. So you start with no idea how to tie your shoes, and then you practice for like a week, and you can do it forever, and you know how to tie your shoes. You know how to tie your shoes from then on. A difficult task, on the other hand, something like, for instance, learning to play a musical instrument, may take years of learning and has what we refer to as a very shallow learning curve, where the difficulty is shown by the very shallow, slow advance on that learning curve. Right? Now, we can break learning down, most of our learning, particularly our behavioral learning, we can break down into two basic kinds. And the first of those, and the most basic of those, is non-associative learning. Anything with a nervous system can do non-associative learning. Sea cucumbers do non-associative learning. That's your most basic form of central nervous system that any animal has, is a sea cucumber. And there's two kinds of non-associative learning. There's habituation and sensitization. Habituation occurs over a period of time. You have a weakened response to a stimuli as a result of repeated presentation over a period of time. For instance, where I live about 300 yards from a train track. So of course we can hear the train all the time. It used to wake us up. On our first night here, we barely got any sleep because the train would wake us up every few minutes. Within a couple of days, we no longer heard the train at all. Right? We habituated to the sound of the train. Now we only hear it if we're trying to watch TV quietly or talking on the phone, something of that nature. Sensitization is the opposite of that. It's an increase in response to stimuli after the presentation of a strong stimulus. For instance, the sound of your baby crying causes a sensitization process where you become more prone to respond to that stimuli, more prone, for instance, to wake up in the night when your baby is crying, because you have sensitized to that response. Right? So that's non-associative learning. With non-associative learning, you have one sensory cue, and only one, that you learn essentially either to ignore or to respond to more attentively. And we do this all the time. We actually do non-associative learning. For instance, if you're learning a musical instrument, you become sensitized to sour notes and respond to them more accurately. Most other forms of learning are associative in nature. That is, that we form connections between two or more stimuli. And we break associative learning down generally into classical conditioning and operant conditioning. So because the study of psychology began with classical conditioning, we're going to start with that as well. The study of classical conditioning really began with a Russian biologist by the name of Ivan Pavlov, who was studying dog salivation in response to presentation of food. His experiment was ruined because the dogs began salivating long before the food was presented to them, because the dog heard the laboratory assistants advancing down the corridor. They heard the footsteps. Why did the dogs do this? Pavlov needed to know. So he began doing a series of experiments and examining the results of those experiments and giving us words to define what was happening. And he said that when we begin the process of classical conditioning, we begin with an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. If we use his experiments as our baseline, then we talk about the unconditioned stimulus of, for instance, dog food, and the unconditioned response being salivation to the presentation of dog food. It's important when we talk about the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response that we remember that the unconditioned response is an instinctive, uncontrollable behavior. It's something that happens outside of your control. Not even humans can control these behaviors. If you're presented with food, you will salivate. That is an unconditioned response, and it happens to all humans, to all animals, as long as they have salivary glands, of course, no matter, as long as they're presented with delicious foods. Things like blinking when someone blows into your eye or startling at a loud noise. These are active, unconditioned responses. Okay? And they happen without any learning. Then, in order to produce classical conditioning, you have to add a conditioned stimulus to this. The conditioned stimulus begins as what we refer to as a neutral stimulus. A neutral stimulus has no behavioral response whatsoever. If I came up and rang a bell at you, you would not salivate. You have no reason to. But if I make it a conditioned stimulus by ringing a bell and then presenting you with food, and then I wait several hours for you to get hungry again, of course, and then I ring a bell and present you with food, and then I ring a bell and present you with food, and ring a bell and present you with food, we get what we refer to as a conditioned stimulus. That is, I have paired this tone, this bell sound, to the presentation of food. And thus, we get, when we ring the bell and do not present the food, we get a conditioned response. Now, it's important to note that the behavior of the conditioned response is identical to the behavior of the unconditioned response. The difference is the source of that response. So, the unconditioned response is salivation when presented with food. The conditioned response is salivation in response to the bell, whether or not food is presented. Okay? So after a period of time, the dogs learned to salivate when a bell rang. That was one of his experiments. He actually experimented with a great many conditioned stimuli in order to determine how far he could stretch this classical conditioning. And it's actually, you can stretch it very, very far. No animal has very good control over classical conditioning responses. Okay. Here's a good visual for you. Okay, you have the unconditioned stimulus that leads to the unconditioned response. Then you pair the conditioned stimulus of opening the door and the unconditioned stimulus of the food. You're still getting the unconditioned response because the food is being presented. But later on, if you open that door, you receive a conditioned response even when you do not present food. All right, so little test, see how well you do, to identify the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned response in these examples. So the first example is actually really good. We say, Jonathan loves spicy food, and last week he ate at Tia Mexicana 3 times and literally perspired. He sweated from the hot spices in the food. Yesterday, as he drove past the restaurant, Jonathan began to perspire. All right. The unconditioned stimulus. Remember, this is the stimulus that provokes an automatic response. If you said it was the spices in the food, excellent. The spices in the food cause the unconditioned response, which is perspiring as a result of the spicy foods. The conditioned stimulus began as a neutral stimulus, but now causes a response. The conditioned stimulus, in this case, is seeing the restaurant, because he saw the restaurant and then ate spicy food and perspired from it. So he paired that visual stimuli with the sensory stimuli of the spicy food. The conditioned response in this case to seeing the restaurant is perspiring as a result of seeing the restaurant. Okay. Notice both the unconditioned and the conditioned responses are both, in this case, perspiration, sweating. But it depends on why he's perspiring. Okay. You can look at the other one, try and determine what the unconditioned and conditioned stimuli and responses are. The process of classical conditioning takes time and effort, and it actually has a series of processes that are involved within the acquisition of a classically conditioned response. And the first stage is acquisition. I just used the word, but the first stage is acquisition, which is the initial learning of the stimulus-response relationship. You never acquire the connection between the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response. That is always instinctive. However, you can acquire the link between the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. And the pairing of the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus together is the acquisition phase. Once you have acquired the response, it will last for a period of time. However, these conditionings are not permanent as such. They are a form of learning, and we can learn, just as we learn to pair those two things, we can learn that they are not paired to one another. And thus we have what we refer to as extinction. In this case, ringing the bell causes you to salivate after having paired food with it for a period of time. However, if I continue to ring the bell and not present you with food, you will begin to stop salivating to the sound of the bell. That is, we have extinguished that behavior. We have extinguished that conditioning. Okay. And we actually do this in order to reduce the classical conditioning, particularly for fear conditioning. We present someone with the conditioned stimulus over and over and over in order to extinguish, for instance, the fear response. Spontaneous recovery, however, can occur after any period of time. If I stop ringing the bell after you have extinguished the need to salivate when you hear a bell, and I stop ringing the bell, and then a year later I come up and I ring a bell at you, you might begin to salivate again. You have experienced what we refer to as spontaneous recovery. In that case, the conditioned response occurs after a time delay, and we don't have to reacquire that connection between the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response. It just happens. And then stimulus generalization occurs when you acquire or when you use a generalized stimulus rather than a specific one in order to elicit a conditioned response. For instance, if I trained a dog to salivate when I press middle C on the piano, he may also begin salivating when I press high C on the piano, or F sharp. It doesn't make any difference to the dog. The point is that I pushed a key on the piano and the dog begins to salivate. You can also produce what we refer to as stimulus discrimination. But stimulus discrimination is much more difficult. For instance, if I wanted the dog to salivate only when I pressed F sharp, I could do that, but it would mean extinguishing all of the other notes and leaving only that F sharp presenting with food. Okay? So it's much more difficult to produce stimulus discrimination than it is to produce stimulus generalization. I referred to little Albert in chapter 1. This is actually a picture of little Albert. John Watson took this small baby with his parents' permission and presented him with a white rat, and he showed that the baby was not afraid of the rat. It was soft and fluffy and cute and domesticated. It was a safe rat. And they let the kid play with it for a while, and at some point, John Watson snuck up behind this baby with a metal bar and a hammer, and wham! Slammed the hammer down on the metal bar and made a really loud sound, and being a baby, little Albert responded the way babies do. He lost his shit. Little Albert screamed and cried and yelled and let the rat go, right? Well, they paired this over and over and over by presenting the rat and then giving a loud noise after the rat. And after a period of time, little Albert could not handle being around the rat. He would begin to scream and cry when the rat was even in the room. As soon as he saw the rat, he would start screaming and crying. After a certain period of time, Albert even generalized this so that any white fluffy thing became a source of fear for him. And thus Watson showed that humans were subject to classical conditioning, that humans were indeed subject to the same kinds of behavioral conditioning that animals are subject to. He did engage in a period of extinction and extinguished much of the response in little Albert. Little Albert did not survive to adulthood, so we don't know how long that particular conditioning would have lasted in him if he would have experienced a lot of spontaneous recovery. His premature death did not have anything to do with Watson's experiments. It was a medical problem that he had a little bit later in life. But this experiment did happen, and it's not something that we consider ethical anymore. At the time, because we didn't really know what would happen, we didn't really understand how humans would respond. At the time, we thought that humans were radically different than other animals, but really we're not. And this is one of the experiments that showed how not different humans are from other animals in the animal kingdom. John Watson showed that a lot of times this classical conditioning behavior is how we develop fears and phobias. Now, we define a phobia as an exaggerated, irrational fear associated with a particular stimulus. And you can be afraid of anything. You can have a phobia of almost literally anything. And you can look online and there's lists and lists and lists of phobias and fun names for them. Snakes, spiders, heights, the dark, high places. In fact, the most treated phobias are heights and enclosed spaces. For the most part, this makes sense. If you're afraid of clowns, you just don't go to the circus. You avoid clowns. No problem. We don't have to get treated for that necessarily, and fear of clowns is actually very common. But if you're afraid of, for instance, heights or enclosed places, and you work on the 30th floor of a building, you're going to have a very serious problem. Because not only are you then afraid of going to the 30th floor of the building, but the act of getting there requires you to seal yourself in a small metal box and go up. So, we find that we treat acrophobia, which is the fear of heights, and claustrophobia, which is the fear of enclosed spaces, far more than any other fear. Okay. And we treat them by the process of systematic desensitization. That is, by repeated introduction to the feared stimuli, without the unconditioned stimuli. Okay. So if we wanted to make someone no longer afraid of heights, we might get a little small step stool, like a little kid's stool, and have them stand on it. And when they got to where they were comfortable standing on that short stool, we could then have them stand on, say, a chair, and then on a table, and then we might take them up on top of a hill, and then we might take them up on top of a building. And the point is simply to expose them to safe environments where they can experience the source of that fear without actually having anything to fear, so that they can begin to become comfortable and begin to extinguish that natural fear response. Conditioning comes in a lot of different forms. You can have very quick conditioning, you can have conditioning that takes a very long time, sometimes conditioning that takes very little time. There are absolutely factors that we can take and measure and examine when we determine how quickly a conditioning is going to take hold. Now, the first of those factors is how reliably the conditioned stimulus predicts the unconditioned stimulus. And this is actually really important. The conditioned stimulus has to predict the unconditioned stimulus. It has to be presented first, not just paired with, but it has to tell the animal that the unconditioned stimulus is coming. Otherwise, it doesn't work. If you produce the unconditioned stimulus and then the conditioned stimulus, nothing happens. Okay? It has to be consistent. It has to be repeated. The next issue we have is the number of pairings of the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. This rarely works the first time. Almost never. Actually, there's only one exception to this rule, and I'll talk about that in a minute. You have to pair the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus together over and over and over again. And there are a couple of things that determine how many times you have to pair them, but really, you have to pair them often in order for this to work. So, you do have to pair them more than once. And then the intensity of the unconditioned stimulus makes a huge difference. For instance, if I made you go without food for several days and then rang a bell and gave you food, and then repeated that process, having you go without food for a couple of days and then ring a bell and give you food, you would actually acquire that stimulus response very quickly. However, if I ring a bell and give you food every half hour, you are far less likely to acquire that as quickly, because the unconditioned stimulus is not as intense. You're not nearly as hungry after a half hour as you are after 2 days. Okay. And then we have to consider the amount of time that elapses between the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. If I ring a bell and then go make food and bring it to you, it's going to take too long, even if it only takes a few minutes. You need to present the conditioned stimulus, the neutral stimulus, and then immediately pair it with the unconditioned stimulus, so that they are connected together, so that they predict one another in the most basic, primal way for that animal's mind, because this behavior is not conscious. This behavior is not something you can plan for. This behavior is not something you can think about in the long term. It's very deep in the primal portions of our brain, very deep in the animal portions of our brain. So this sort of behavior has to be taken very carefully. There is one exception to all of these rules, and that is conditioned taste aversion. Now, we've always sort of known about conditioned taste aversion. It's always been a thing, but our ability to study conditioned taste aversion has really only become a major impact on our society in the last couple of decades, when we developed chemotherapy for cancer therapies. Okay. Chemotherapy is a radioactive chemical that attacks and destroys cancer cells. However, it's also extremely toxic, and your body's general response to having something extremely toxic induced into it is vomiting. And it is extremely predictable when someone gets a dose of chemotherapy, they begin vomiting after a set period of time. And what we discover is that in those cases, your body and your brain respond then to the last thing you ate as though it were the poison. It doesn't matter how long it's been. Okay? We started by attempting to say, all right, well, don't eat for 24 hours and then come in and take it. It didn't make any difference. The last thing that they ate, the last thing that they tasted, still developed this conditioned taste aversion. And it occurs after only one pairing. All it takes is one event for that violent, negative, toxic reaction to be paired with the taste of food. So, what we began doing with chemotherapy is giving people what we refer to as a scapegoat flavor. Usually something that you're not going to like anyway. They let you taste that and then give you the chemotherapy so that your taste aversion is developed to something that you wouldn't eat anyway. Okay? As opposed to developing an aversion to a flavor that you would ordinarily enjoy. Okay? So it only takes one pairing to develop a taste aversion, and that's really important, because if Caveman Ugg is going around eating new mushrooms that he finds, and he gets violently sick after eating a mushroom, his body needs to remember which mushrooms were toxic. So this instinctive biological conditioning response keeps humans alive, right? It is an evolutionary survival technique. Operant conditioning is somewhat more complex, neurologically speaking and behaviorally speaking, than classical conditioning. With classical conditioning, you can produce a response cycle for things like blinking or startling, salivating, for fear. You can produce all of these instinctive, simple responses. There is no way to ring a bell and your child compulsively picks up their room. It would be nice, but it doesn't work that way. Because picking up your room isn't an instinctive behavior. It is, however, a behavior that we want to encourage. So how do we encourage that behavior? We encourage that behavior by using operant or instrumental conditioning. I like operant conditioning. In operant conditioning, we learn by a process of pairing reinforcement or punishment behaviors with a response. Okay. This was developed at first by a scientist named Edward Thorndike, who gave us the law of effect. He said behaviors with pleasurable responses are more likely to continue. So if you do a behavior and you get a pleasurable response from it, a pleasurable result from it, then you'll want to engage in that behavior again. If you experience an unpleasant result, then you will be less likely to continue that behavior. So Edward Thorndike gave us this law of effect. B.F. Skinner codified this law of effect into what he referred to as operant conditioning. Okay. And Skinner did a ton of research on operant conditioning and the way that it affects organisms, including humans. Most of the time when we talk about operant conditioning, we're going to talk about reinforcement rather than punishment. There's several reasons for this, and we're going to get into why punishment doesn't work so well later, but just for now, take my word for it, punishment doesn't work so well, and we're going to focus on reinforcement. Reinforcement increases the likelihood that a behavior will be repeated in the future. Okay? There is no way to cause a behavior by using reinforcement. Instead, reinforcement makes a behavior more likely to repeat. Okay? And there are two kinds of reinforcement. You can use positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement. And it's important, very important, to remember that in psychology we do not refer to things as being positive. We don't generally refer to things as being positive, meaning that it's good, and negative, meaning that it's bad. Rather, positive means that we're adding something, and negative means that we're taking something away, just like math. Positive reinforcement is when we add, say, praise, food, money, sex, things that the organism enjoys, things that make the organism happy. Okay? And it increases the likelihood that the organism will do the behavior again. Okay? If your cat does a trick and then you give her a treat, she is more likely to do that trick again in the future in order to get treats. This actually does work. You can train cats. My daughter trains cats. Negative reinforcement, on the other hand, is the removal of an unpleasant stimulus. For instance, you stop nagging, you fix the drain pipe so that it doesn't drip anymore. Okay? You remove painful cravings by taking more of your drug. That's negative reinforcement, and it increases the likelihood that a behavior will happen again. Okay? If you get into a car and turn on the car and never buckle your seatbelt, you will receive the negative, unpleasant stimulus of a nagging, beeping, ding, 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 ding. And depending on the age of your car, it might stop after a little while, and it might never stop. Okay? By buckling your seatbelt, you make the ding, ding, ding stop. Okay? That's negative reinforcement. Right? And it works. Punishment decreases the likelihood that a behavior will occur in the future. And it's important, punishment decreases the likelihood that it will occur in the future. Punishment does not prevent the behavior from happening again. It doesn't stop the behavior from happening again. It simply makes it less likely. Okay? And again, we can have positive punishments and we can have negative punishments. If positive punishments, again, we're adding something to their environment. We can yell, we can spank or hit them, we can use put downs, we can disparage them. All of these things prevent a behavior from happening again. Okay? Negative punishments remove something from their environment. We can use the silent treatment, for instance, and remove pleasant social interaction from their world. Okay? We can remove car or phone privileges from our teenagers. We can do timeouts for our younger ones. Right? This discourages repetitions of behavior in the future. Remember that both of these have positive elements. And with any positive element, you are always adding something, whether you're adding something pleasant for reinforcement or adding something unpleasant in terms of punishment, okay, in order to increase or decrease the likelihood of a behavior in the future. And both of these have a negative cycle, okay, where we can remove something unpleasant in order to increase a behavior, or we can remove something pleasant in order to decrease a behavior. Okay. So we have both negative and positive on both reinforcement and punishment. And remember that negative and positive do not indicate whether something is good or bad, but only indicates whether you are adding or removing something from their environment. Returning to our focus on reinforcers, there are two basic kinds of reinforcers. You can have primary reinforcers, and just like the unconditioned stimulus in classical conditioning, primary reinforcers require no learning on the part of the organism. Things like food, for instance, or water are primary reinforcers because they satisfy a basic biological function that is necessary for that organism. Okay. Comfort would be another primary reinforcer, although how we define comfort can be very different for different organisms. What is defined as good food can be very different for different organisms as well. Cats don't like chocolate, they don't enjoy it. So you can't reward a cat with chocolate. Okay. It's not a primary reinforcer for cats. Primary reinforcers are always satisfy some basic biological drive that the organism has. Okay. Secondary reinforcers have to be learned. And our biggest secondary reinforcer, the one that sort of dominates human society, is money. This is our biggest secondary reinforcer. Secondary reinforcers have to be learned. If you have a 3-year-old and you offer him a piece of candy or a $10 bill, guess which one he's going to take? Probably the candy. Because the candy requires very little learning. He knows that the candy is going to satisfy his urges. The $10 bill doesn't mean a whole lot. A 3-year-old might be a little bit old for that. A 6-month-old, say. You give him, something cute, a toy, or a $10 bill. He's going to take the toy because the toy is pleasant, the toy is nice. We have to learn later on that money gets us things that we want. Money provides us with primary and even other secondary reinforcers that we can use to find pleasure in the world. So, in general, when you think about it, when you think about secondary reinforcers, always think about money. Secondary reinforcers usually do not have any pleasure in and of themselves. Okay? We get pleasure through something else from them. There are several different schedules of reinforcement we can use. The most common, when you think about a schedule of reinforcement, the most common one you might think about is a continuous reinforcement. You're trying to train your child to potty train, for instance. So the child uses the potty and they get an M&M. Yay, I got chocolate. And then they use the potty and they get an M&M. And they got chocolate again. And then they use the potty and they get another M&M. And every time they use the potty, they get an M&M. That's continuous reinforcement. But continuous reinforcement is actually not the best reinforcement schedule that we can use. Instead, what we often use and what we want to use and what we often use one way or the other because it's easier is an intermittent reinforcement schedule where we can reinforce the behavior some of the time, not all of the time, but some of the time. And it actually makes our reinforcements more effective in the long run to reinforce it some of the time rather than all of the time. We have sort of a grid of schedules. We have ratio schedules and interval schedules. And within each one of those, we have a fixed and a variable schedule. So when we look at a fixed ratio schedule, we're looking at, for instance, piecework. Okay? If you get paid after a set number of responses, okay, you are on a fixed ratio schedule. Let's say you get paid for putting the caps on toothpaste tubes, right? And after every 10 caps that you put on the toothpaste tubes, somebody comes along and hands you $1. And every time you put 10 on, they hand you $1. And then you put on 10 more and they hand you $1. And you put on 10 more and they hand you $1. That's a fixed ratio schedule. That's piecework. Variable ratio schedules are a little bit more sketchy. If you're putting tubes on the toothpaste in about every 10 times. Maybe it's 8 this time. Maybe it's 15 next time. It could be 7 before you get your next one, and then it could be 25 before you get your next $1. Okay, that's a variable ratio schedule, and generally a variable ratio schedule has an average number of times. Okay, so it averages perhaps every 10 cycles. Now, you wouldn't want to get paid this way, except that evidence says that you do want to get paid this way. Casinos use this, and use this very, very effectively. Variable ratio schedules actually have the fastest response rate of all of these intermittent reinforcement cycles. People and animals both will engage with their target far more when they're given a variable ratio schedule than when they're given any other cycle. Because you don't know when you're going to be rewarded, but you do know that you will be rewarded eventually. Okay. Slot machines are a perfect example of a variable ratio schedule. Okay. There's even a variable ratio on how big the reward is. And how intense the reward is, essentially. We can also look at interval schedules. We can look at a fixed interval schedule, which almost everyone is on. It's a paycheck schedule. Right? Most people don't get this piecework schedule. We instead get the schedule of a paycheck. We can get paid once a month. We can get paid every 2 weeks. We can get paid every week. Some people get paid every day. This fixed interval schedule means that you engage in your behavior, and then after a period of time, you will experience a reward for your behavior. Okay, this actually has the worst response rate. This has the slowest response rate of all of these intermittent reinforcement schedules, and yet it's the one that we actually use most commonly, despite its lack of efficacy. And we use it because it's easy. Okay. The last of these is a variable interval schedule, and we almost never use a variable interval schedule, at least not in any deliberate way. But reinforcement in this case occurs at varying time intervals, almost at random. And this produces superstitions. Variable interval schedules are how we develop our superstitions, because we never know when we're going to be reinforced. So we develop odd behaviors based on what we think is reinforcing, but even though that's not actually what's reinforcing. Okay. So a variable interval schedule, and we very rarely use it in the real world, or we very rarely use it deliberately because it's so difficult to use, and because it has such a poor response rate. This is a graph of the way that we respond, and you can see we have here on the horizontal the number of times. Or on the horizontal we have how many minutes, okay, have passed. And here on the vertical we have how many responses. All right, total responses are engaged. So you can see, for instance, with a variable ratio schedule here, you get this extremely rapid sequence of responses, and it's continuous. Even when the person gets reinforced here where these lines meet, okay, they don't stop. They keep going. They keep pounding away at that lever in order to get the next reward, the next reward, the next reward, because they never know when it's going to be coming. With this fixed ratio schedule, every time the person gets a reward, here, 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 they stop responding for a moment to enjoy their reward, because they know how many times they have to engage in that behavior in order to be rewarded again. With a fixed interval reward, this very slow rewarding schedule, you can see that every time you get rewarded, again, the behavior stops briefly. But then instead of spiking again, like with the fixed ratio, it slowly increases over time until the next reward is struck. And if you think about this, every time, when you get paid once a week, you show up on Monday and you don't want to do it, right? It's not important to do it. And then on Tuesday, you might be feeling just a little bit motivated, and then by Wednesday, you realize Friday's creeping up, the boss is going to come check in, you need to get it done. By Thursday, you're actually getting your work on, and then by Friday, you have to get it finished before the boss comes and pays you, and so you're working really hard, and then the boss comes and pays you, and then on Monday, you don't want to work anymore. That's normal, right? That's how animals respond to this fixed interval schedule. And then the variable interval schedule, you can see, is, again, a very continuous, smooth way of responding, but it's very slow, because it doesn't have anything to do with how many times you respond. You only have to respond once after a random period of time occurs. So you sort of poke the key and then go do something else and then come back and poke the key again. Windows does this to me. So that's part of why I don't like Windows. We use operant conditioning and we use reinforcement schedules for behavior modification. Okay? A planned effort to change behavior, not just a child's behavior, but animals and adults as well. We change their behavior by reinforcing desirable behaviors. and avoiding the reinforcement of undesired behaviors. Okay? So when your child throws a tantrum, right, and your children will throw a tantrum, I like the restaurant metaphor for this, or not the restaurant, but the grocery store metaphor for this. So you're in the grocery store, you've been shopping, your kid's been good, and then you go to checkout, and you go into this little narrow aisle, and what's on either side of you in this little aisle? Candy. Right? It's everywhere, and it's right at eye level for the kid, so the kid knows the candy is there. There's no way to avoid, like you can blindfold them, I guess. But the kid knows the candy is there, so they want the candy. They throw a fit, they start screaming, you get embarrassed. You want the screaming to stop, so you give the kid a candy. What have you done? You have reinforced screaming. You have given the child positive reinforcement. They screamed, they got candy. You have been reinforced also. You have received negative reinforcement. You gave the candy and the screaming stopped. You have received negative reinforcement. And this is a vicious cycle. We actually use that term, vicious cycle, in order to describe exactly what's happening here. Instead, what's necessary is that you avoid responding to this tantrum. Don't acknowledge it at all. Okay? They want something. Don't give it to them. Instead, make them ask. And when they ask, give them candy. At least the first time. You have to give them candy. You have to reward the asking. Now, next time you go in, they may throw a fit. They don't get candy if they throw a fit. They have to ask again. And for a little while, you may have to give them little candy rewards as they ask. It won't take too long before you can put them on, essentially, a variable ratio schedule where sometimes when they ask, you say yes, and sometimes when they ask, you say no. It stops the tantrums. It doesn't happen immediately. And even with this kind of behavior, you'll still get that spontaneous recovery, where after a period of time your child might throw another tantrum, but it will be significantly weaker and the child is more likely to stop and ask when they're not immediately rewarded for that tantrum. We can also use shaping. We can use operant conditioning for shaping, which is to reward a behavior that is increasingly similar to a desired behavior. If you want to teach your dog, for instance, to shake, the first thing you're going to do is when your dog just sort of lifts its paw off the ground, he's not going to necessarily get it into your hand, he's not going to necessarily leave it there, but he lifts his paw off the ground. That's enough. That's the first step to shaking hands, so you reward that. You immediately give him a treat. He picked up his hand, he gets a treat. Next time, he needs to pick up his hand a little bit higher to get that treat, and higher, and eventually he needs to touch your hand with his paw. And then he needs to put his paw in your hand, and then he has to leave his paw in your hand. And so you shape this behavior by rewarding behaviors that look more and more and more like what you want the behavior to look like. We use this for children too. If we're doing academic learning, if we're doing, for instance, learning a musical instrument, right? You're going to reward the child for things that are more and more and more like what you want. You can do shaping on yourself. If you're teaching yourself a musical instrument, you feel good when it sounds right. So you are essentially rewarding yourself for closer and closer approximations of the correct behavior. And that's shaping. Just like with classical conditioning, operant conditioning has factors that make it more or less efficient for you to use these reinforcers. The first of these is the magnitude of the reinforcer. Okay? As the magnitude of the reinforcement increases, the response acquisition is significantly faster. For instance, if I wanted you to work in a factory for 40 hours a week and I was going to pay you $50 a week, you would probably not want to do that. The reinforcement is not strong enough. $200 a month is insufficient. If, however, I wanted you to do grueling work in a factory and I was going to pay you $1,000 a week, you would very likely pick up those skills very rapidly. The better our reinforcement is, the more efficiently we can activate the desire to learn and acquire these behaviors. The same goes with food, for instance. If you're not hungry, then food is not a very good reinforcement. And an expensive meal is probably a better reinforcement than McDonald's. Okay. The magnitude of the reinforcement is important. The immediacy of the reinforcement is critical. Reinforcement should happen immediately after the desired behavior occurs, particularly in animals. If your dog shakes your hand and you leave the room, get his treats, come back, and then give him a treat, what have you just rewarded? The fact is, you don't know. You could have rewarded anything. You might have rewarded him peeing on the carpet. You don't know. Because the last thing he did is what you've rewarded him for. Okay? So the immediacy of the reinforcement is critical. Now, with verbal children and adults, often we can reward them for things that have happened in the past by saying, I love that you did this, here's a reward for it. Okay? And that allows us to reinforce something that has happened in the past for humans. But it's still not quite as effective as a reward for a behavior that happens immediately. And then the level of motivation of the learner is very critical. If food is used as a reinforcer, a hungry animal learns faster than a full animal. Okay? If you're very motivated to learn a skill, you're far more likely to acquire that skill quickly. Okay? For instance, I taught myself guitar. I was motivated. I enjoyed doing it. I had fun. It was my dad's guitar, so I learned it pretty quickly. My mother, on the other hand, was forced into piano lessons for something like 13 years. I doubt that she could find middle C. She doesn't know where it is because she never cared. She was never motivated to learn the piano, so she simply didn't. And it's actually relatively common for that kind of thing to happen. So the relative motivation of the learner makes a huge difference. All right. So that's reinforcement. Now, reinforcement, remember, works very well, and you don't have to reinforce every event that occurs. You can do reinforcement schedules. You can do intermittent reinforcement, where you only have to reinforce some of the things. In fact, it works better if you only reward some of the behaviors. With punishment, however, it doesn't work that way. And remember that punishment does not extinguish an undesired behavior. All punishment does is suppress the behavior. And it really only does it when the punishing agent is present. Okay? If, for instance, you have children who are relatively well behaved, they follow the rules all the time, they do what they're supposed to be doing, and you send them to grandma's house for a week. And what you get back are not children. They are little monsters who have never heard of the rules, let alone actually follow them. Right? The punishing agent was not present. Grandma didn't punish, whether because she couldn't keep up with them to actually do it, or she simply didn't care and would give them whatever they wanted. Both kinds of grandma is totally valid, and it's a grandma's job to spoil their kids, but these behaviors are happening, and then when they are returned home, the child is a maniac because they've gotten out of the habit of obeying the rules. So this behavior, punishing behavior, does suppress the behavior as long as the punishing agent is present. When the punishing agent is no longer present, then the punishment ceases to be effective. Okay? One of the other big problems with punishment is that it shows that a behavior is unacceptable, but it does not develop an appropriate behavior. Okay? If you steal from a store, we punish you. We put you in jail for a while, maybe. But what have we taught you by putting you in jail? Well, we've taught you that stealing is, we might have taught you that stealing is wrong. But have we taught you to do something better? Probably not. Particularly in America, our prison system is punitive rather than rehabilitative. So we don't teach our prisoners a better, more effective, more appropriate method. Instead, we just punish them for their behavior, and then we have repeat offenders. We have criminal recidivism that is up in something like the 60% range. Okay. Punishing a child for hitting, you give them a timeout, for instance, and then when they get out of timeout, you discuss. You were in timeout because you hit your friend. Now, instead of hitting your friend, why don't you try? Okay. And that teaches the child a more effective way of doing things. Now, sometimes it is necessary to punish an undesired behavior so that you can begin to shape a desired behavior. Okay? If a child is still using the bathroom in their pants, you may have to punish that behavior somehow, and then continue to enforce and reinforce even attempting to use the toilet. Okay? And that helps reinforce that behavior and helps the child learn to use the toilet. Okay? So punishment should always be paired with. Okay? Often, a person who is severely punished becomes fearful and angry toward the punisher. Okay? Children who are abused are far more likely to run away from home. Children who receive harsh punishments, like extreme spankings, that sort of thing, are far more likely to run away from home. They're more likely to become hostile or aggressive or undisciplined children because they're being taught not to behave in an appropriate way, but they're being taught to avoid punishment. And that's generally all that punishment manages to do, is to teach you to avoid the punishment. When you do have to punish a behavior, and we do have to punish behaviors, but when you have to punish behaviors, negative punishment is far more efficient and far more effective. By removing something pleasant so that the person is less likely to engage in that behavior, and then rewarding the desired behavior by giving it back, you actually produce a more effective punishment. And with people, with kids, you can tell them why they were being punished and why they're being rewarded, and reinforce. You can reinforce essentially the reinforcement. Physical punishment often leads to aggression because people who observe physical punishment, people who are engaged in physical punishment, begin to believe that that is the only way to control, that is how you control other people. It's extremely common, actually, for kids who are repeatedly struck at home, even spankings. They learn not that that is a punishment for their behavior, but they learn that that is how their parents control their behavior. And so they engage in violent behaviors in order to control, for instance, classmates' behaviors. Okay, so they model this aggressive behavior. So how do we make punishment effective? We can make punishment effective, and there are several ways that we can make punishment more effective than it would be if we just sort of randomly doled it out. The best way to make punishment effective is to punish during the undesired behavior. Or if it's impossible to punish during the undesired behavior, punish immediately after the undesired behavior. Because interrupting that behavior removes the rewarding aspects of that behavior, and instead causes that behavior to become more uncomfortable for that person. Okay. The longer the delay between the response and the punishment, the less effective the punishment is. Okay. Especially with animals, they do not remember. They don't remember why they're being punished. If you punish them, if you're gone all day, and they peed on the floor in the morning, punishing them when you get home at night is not helpful, right? Because the dog doesn't remember doing it. At the very least, they don't know why they were being punished, right? You could be punishing them for running off an intruder. You don't know. Okay. So you do have to be very careful with how and when you apply punishments. You also need to make sure that the punishment reminds the individual of the incident. Okay? And particularly with humans, remind them why they're being punished. Remind them what they did. Tell them what it was, why it was inappropriate, and what a better way to handle the situation would have been. Otherwise, the punishment is not effective. Right. Punishment should always be at the minimum severity. Intense punishments cause the person to lash out, but if the punishment is not powerful enough, then the individual will still seek out the rewarding aspects of that unwanted behavior. So you have to punish just enough, but not too much. Right? Just enough to make it not rewarding, but not so much that they become angry with you. This is a very delicate balancing act because everyone is different. Right? Everyone's tolerance for punishment is different. So your ability to punish someone just enough is very, very difficult to balance that, particularly when you're balancing a society on the idea of punishments. It doesn't work and it's not effective. Okay? And then again, punishments must be very consistent. You cannot ever use an intermittent schedule of punishment. Intermittent schedules of reinforcement are good, not punishment. Punishments must be extremely consistent. Punishments must be very, very, it has to be every time the behavior occurs. And it has to always be punished in the same way. If it's a child, both parents have to punish in the same way. Grandma has to punish in the same way, exactly in the same way. Okay? And you have to punish the behavior every time. An undesired response will be suppressed more effectively when the probability of a punishment is high. Okay? If you're speeding, and be honest, you probably do, and you see a police officer, you slow down. Why? Because you are more likely to be punished for speeding when a police officer is present. You are less likely to be punished for speeding if you cannot see a police officer. Okay. So punishments must be extremely consistent, and they're not, particularly within the criminal justice system. The punishments are not extremely consistent, and they have to be. They have to be in order to be effective. But these punishments are not being applied consistently, and never have been. It's one of the big drawbacks of the criminal justice system. All right, this is a rough one. Learned helplessness is what happens when operant conditioning goes bad. Okay? If you reward and punish at random, so that the person has no way of being able to predict what will happen and when, they can develop what we refer to as learned helplessness, where they develop a desire to fail to respond to any situation. They may become extremely obedient, but that's really only to avoid punishment as much as possible. They avoid the punishments that they can predict, but they will stop behaving in a predictable and productive manner because they can't predict when they will be rewarded or when they will be punished. Battered spouse syndrome is a form of learned helplessness, and we also believe that it's tied to PTSD. The inability to predict when an event will occur that may endanger an individual or their loved ones or their troop, their family, what have you, is tied to this PTSD and to learned helplessness. Okay? Operant and classical conditioning are both a result of paired stimuli. You have a behavior, you have an unconditioned and conditioned stimuli, or you have a behavior and a reward, or a behavior and a punishment. Cognitive learning is not a result of this associative conditioning, but rather a result of changing neural networks inside your brain. Okay. A couple of examples of one way that we can look at cognitive learning is looking, for instance, at latent learning. And there's two kinds of latent learning that we can look at fairly easily. The first is spatial navigation learning, essentially being able to carry a map in your head. And we can all do this. But spatial navigational learning in this case happens when, say, you move into a new town. So you spend some time just wandering around the town, driving around, finding out what's down there, looking around, seeing what's happening. We do this a lot less now that we have like Google Maps and stuff, but it still works. It's still very effective for being able to find your way around any given town. And then when you actually need to be able to go somewhere, you sort of have a map that's been built up in your mind. And even though you never needed it until then, suddenly you can sort of be able to put that together and be able to plan out a route to this new location by using the map that's already present in your head. We can see this actually by using a rat maze. If we look at the pattern of responding for rats in a maze, we can start looking at a graph like this. And when we have rats that are never rewarded for finishing the maze, their behavior sort of stays up here, where they spend a lot of time solving the maze. There's no motivation for them to get through it. If, however, we always reward rats for passing the maze, then they start really high, but they fairly quickly come down in the amount of time it takes them to solve the maze. And so that's sort of the second group, is this group that can solve the maze fairly quickly because they're rewarded for solving the maze every time. Now, if we have a third group of mice and we don't immediately reward them, they're going to start up just like group 1. But then about the 10th time they go through the maze, we do start rewarding them. All of a sudden, it's not going to take them any time at all to solve the maze. It takes them the bare minimum amount of time to complete the maze because they have this detailed map of the maze already built up in their mind from wandering around during these sessions up here. And then once we reward them, they can very quickly find their way through the maze to the end reward because they already have that maze built up. The other way we can look at this is using, for instance, insight learning, where we can have this moment of, oh, I get it. When you're in the middle of a math test, you've never understood the problem before, and then all of a sudden it clicks and everything makes sense. That's insight learning. And essentially you've been exposed to it so often that all of a sudden you make that connection and it becomes clear for you so that you can work with that information. That's insight learning, and it's a basic form of cognitive learning. With observational learning, behavior is acquired by observing the actions of others. And we refer to this as modeling. Unfortunately, we have a problem with naming things occasionally. So modeling occurs if you are engaged in a behavior and allowing someone else to watch, you are modeling that behavior. If you are watching the behavior that someone is engaging in and learning from it, then you are modeling their behavior. Okay? So we have the same word that's being used in two different ways, unfortunately, but that's sort of the way it is sometimes with sciences. In any case, this observational learning, we're learning by watching someone else. Albert Bandura did a very famous experiment with this observational learning. He took a inflatable doll, and it was called the Bobo doll. It was a relatively famous at the time toy that was being used, and you'd put sand or water in the bottom of it, and then the rest of it would inflate, and it was a balloon. And the sand in the bottom made Bobo the doll stand up so that you could smack Bobo around and hit him with things, and he would always stand right back up so that you could hit him again. The toy was intended to be hit. Okay, that's sort of important for this. The toy was intended to be hit. And what Bandura did was he showed children a video. Okay, and there were 3 versions of the video. In all 3 versions of the video, an adult would come in with a wooden mallet and just beat the snot out of Bobo doll. Just smack it around like brutally, far worse than the doll was ever really intended to be used. And then he gave a reinforcement version where the adult was given candy afterwards. He gave a punishment version where after attacking the doll, the adult was scolded. And then he gave a no consequences version where the adult just walked away from the doll after it was done. And then how the child interacted with the Bobo doll. And what he found was that the children who observed the adult being rewarded for attacking the Bobo doll were far more likely to attack the Bobo doll. And as a result, Bandura came up with the conclusion that violent media causes children to become more violent. However, Bandura has been not attacked, but he's been debunked to a certain extent with more recent investigations, because he did show that the adult was rewarded for their behavior. What happens is that the child expected to be rewarded. They figured if they attacked this doll that they would be rewarded for doing so. That was what they learned, was that attacking this doll would teach them to, would get them a reward. Children who saw the version where the adult was punished did not attack the doll because they anticipated being punished if they attacked the doll. It did not, however, cause the children to become more or less violent in the long run. In fact, what we found more recently is that children who are by nature more violent are more likely to be drawn to violent media. On the other hand, many children, particularly in the age of video games, these children will be drawn to violent video games in order to express their violent feelings, but through an acceptable medium, so that they're not actually attacking other people. Instead, all of their aggression is being taken out on these digital characters that have no feelings, that are not being harmed by this process. Okay? So Bandura has been Bandura's experiments are still useful, but not necessarily for the conclusion that many people are using them for. Okay? Violent media does not make violent people. Violent people are attracted to more violent media. Okay? That being said, almost everyone watches violent media. It's sort of part of our nature. Although showing children media where violence is punished, for instance, crime procedural shows, my kids watch those, and they know through that violent behavior is punished, right? Because the bad guys get caught. On the other hand, having them watch, for instance, professional wrestling where violence is rewarded might not be such a great idea, unless you're going to also instill the ethics of the sport, which can alter that behavior as well. Human behavior is very complex, and it can rarely be broken down into such a simple thing as Bandura was discussing. So what facilitates our ability to learn, to cognitively learn, right? Timing is very important for us to be able to learn. Multiple exposures to information allows us to alter our cognitive landscape. It allows us to alter our neural networks in order to accommodate new information. Okay? So studying material over and over and over in short bursts rather than long periods of concentrated study actually does increase your likelihood of retaining that information. We also have context and state cues. If you're going, for instance, to be taking a test while you're sitting up at a desk, why would you study for that test while you're lying down on your bed? You don't want to do that. Instead, you want to sit at your desk and emulate the environment in which you will actually be taking the test, so that you can because that allows your brain to call up that information more efficiently. You should also study sober, unless, of course, you're taking, for instance, a prescription medication for ADD, for instance. Then you do want to be under the effects of your medication while you're studying, so that you can be under that same effect while you're taking your test. Okay. Most types of learning do require also awareness and attention. You can't be not paying attention. You can't be asleep and learn things. As much as that would be nice to shove a math book under your pillow and learn it while you're asleep, it doesn't work that way. You have to be paying attention. And then sleep is absolutely necessary for learning. Sleep is how your brain hits the save button. It's how you record information into long-term memory. It is very important to sleep after studying, so it's actually very efficient to study late, not when you're super sleepy, but at a reasonable hour before going to bed. At one time, we believed that there was a mechanism in the brain, a physical device called an engram, that stored memory. Now we know that engrams do not exist. In fact, we have attempted with mice to take brains apart in order to determine how memories are stored, because by taking pieces of brain out, we should be able to disrupt access to memory. But often it's not possible to do so. Even removing the portions of the brain that allow those memories to be processed, those portions, the mice were still able, for instance, to run the maze even after those areas of the brain were removed. The brain compensated for the removed tissue. We also at one time believed that we used long-term potentiation in our synapses. That is, that our brain cells actually retained an electric charge so that they would be easier to fire over a period of time. Now we know that our brain is actually far more complex than that. Your brain is a quantum processing network that uses these neurons not necessarily as a storage medium, but as a transmission medium, allowing communication between the quantum processing area of your brain and the far more simple tissues of, for instance, muscles and glands. We also develop new neural networks extremely rapidly. It's not simply long-term potentiation, but actually forming new connections. And we can form these very quickly, developing new patterns and new networks within the brain. So our awareness of how the brain works and how memory and learning functions has changed dramatically over the last decade. As we learn more and more about the brain and are able to study it as it moves and as it's active. Okay. We do know that children begin learning in utero, that most of that learning is non-associative, right? They learn to respond to sounds, they learn to respond to the little bit of light that they acquire in utero. And they learn a little bit of classical conditioning, but not very much, because they're actually not getting a whole lot of response, right, one way or another. Postnatal learning is extremely rapid. We believe that something like double the number of neural connections within the first few weeks of a child's postnatal life, that is, after being born. The brain develops extremely fast in order to acquire the necessary skills to function outside of the womb. Okay? Being able to cry, being able to trust, being able to consume food, right? All of these things are acquired through maturity, but they require a rapid brain development, and that allows us to learn things far more efficiently. Are there 6 differences in learning? No. Okay, the simple answer is no. We used to think that there were. We used to think that there was. We used to think that men were far better in math and sciences, and women were far better in verbal learning tasks. Now what we know is that while there is an extremely small difference that does lend some credence to this, the difference is so small as to be negligible, particularly since two boys may differ in math skills far more than a group of boys and a group of girls will. So when you start looking at sex differences, you need to look at group differences rather than individual differences, because individual differences don't tell you very much, except that there's a difference in those individuals. Okay. Now, what can happen is what we refer to as stereotype threat. The awareness that there's a negative stereotype associated with some aspect of your identity can interfere with test performance in particular. If a girl is reminded that girls aren't supposed to be very good at math, her math scores may unconsciously dip, even just a little bit. And then of course it's not true, right? Girls are every bit as good at math as boys are, and there's nothing wrong with that, except that we need to drop these negative and harmful stereotypes because they're not helpful. All right, this is what I was talking about about group differences between boys and girls. If you look, for instance, at this distribution, this represents perhaps math distribution or language arts scores, with the blue one being boys and the red one being girls. And yes, there is a difference in these language arts skills. All right, girls are a little bit better than boys on average, but you can see that the distributions for both are virtually identical and so wide that the average differences between boys and girls is what we refer to as negligible. That is, it doesn't make any difference, because the differences between individuals is so large that the group differences don't make any statistical difference. We'll talk more about these norms later on in the semester. Learning disabilities are actually very common, both in children and in adults. Most people don't simply grow out of learning disabilities. Some of the most common learning disabilities, and this is a deficit in a specific area of learning, okay? So we can have what it used to be dyslexia and dyscalculia. Now we refer to it as reading disorder, writing disorder, and mathematics disorder. Right? Those are the terms that we use now. But it is a difficulty in being able to read. It is a difficulty in being able to write. It's a difficulty in being able to process mathematical equations. Often these disorders are associated with a difficulty with, for instance, left and right. They may have trouble with mirror images. They may have trouble with several different aspects of perceiving these things. There have been fonts recently developed to help people with dyslexia be able to read more efficiently by removing a lot of the extraneous information that appears in our written alphabet. Attention deficit disorder is characterized by an inability to pay attention. Be aware that really you're not supposed to diagnose attention deficit disorder until after the child is at least 8 years old. And really we shouldn't be diagnosing it until they're in their teens. All children have attention deficit disorder up to a certain age because the ability to focus attention and maintain attention is a frontal cortex. It all has to do with the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is some of the last portion of the brain to truly mature. So attention deficit disorder should never be diagnosed in small children, 4, 5, 6 years old, because they're too young to have matured into the ability to maintain their attention, and we don't need to be medicating them for that. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is associated with attention deficit disorder, but is characterized by an addition of excessive physical and motor activity, as well as the inability to pay attention. And actually, ADHD does require medication more often than ADD does, and shows a worse prognosis into adulthood. All right, so that's learning. hopefully everything is clear and we can move on to memory shortly. Thank you very much and have a great day.